Hey, good afternoon to you. 507 here at News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us today at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. The Biden administration has, quote, blatantly violated the First Amendment and colluded with big tech to censor the speech of ordinary Americans. That's according to Republican Kentucky Senator Rand Paul speaking to the Daily Caller News Foundation this week. He says federal courts have ordered CISA, the cyber agency in the federal government, to stop. But the trust that CISA has abused cannot be restored until the agency gives a full accounting of what it has done, and Congress changes the law to create severe penalties for anyone who tries to do the same thing in the future. Rand Paul saying this because Republicans in the Senate are right now attempting to strip the powers of the Department of Homeland Security after it engaged in substantial social media censorship over these past few years. For more on this, let's bring in Jon Schweppe. He's the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project, and he joins us now. John, good to talk to you, sir.
Hey, Vince. Thanks so much for having me.
Just in your view, because you obviously you deal with this for a living, how pervasive is the federal government's censorship activities?
Well, I think we saw in 2020 in a number of different ways just how pervasive it was. I don't think we really realized before that it could get to this level, but certainly with COVID, we saw it as a real goal of some of these federal agencies to prevent so-called COVID misinformation. You might remember famously when Tucker had the Chinese whistleblower on his show and the social media company censored distribution of that interview. Turned out to be pretty right that the lab leak theory was actually correct.
Yes.
But they went out of their way to do this. We all know, and we talk about all the time, the Hunter Biden story, some of the political censorship, like the ads of my group, American Principles Project, being removed by Facebook ahead of 2020. But this was actually much more pervasive than that. It was, ordinary citizens saying, hey, I'm not so sure about this vaccine. They're kind of rushing it. Or, hey, I think that this was created by the CCP as a way to change the world or whatever. That was the type of speech that was being removed, and it was being directed by federal agencies.
Yes, it was. And it's also disheartening and worrisome. Rand Paul is pushing a piece of legislation called the Free Speech Protection Act. As he describes it, it would not only require CISA, again, the cyber agency of the federal government under DHS, to come clean about its actions that violated the First Amendment, but it would also establish penalties that will prevent government censorship in the future. That bill would block all government employees from influencing censorship. It levies severe penalties against them. It also prohibits government grants related to misinformation or disinformation and mandates reporting of government censorship requests of protected speech. Now, that all sounds good to me, John. I think those are all perfectly fine additions to the law, something that restrains the federal government's activity. But why wouldn't the feds just ignore this law? They're already ignoring the First Amendment.
Right, and what would the enforcement mechanism be? You'd basically have to sue, and there'd be years of court, and, that might have been after an election. Look, I think this is a great bill. I think, Jim Jordan's introduced it on the House side. I think it's definitely needed. But ultimately, if we're going to prevent this type of stuff from happening, this basically says no explicit direction from the federal government to these social media companies. That doesn't mean implicit. That doesn't mean, there won't be a wink and a nod. And part of the problem is that the entire left-wing ideology is hell-bent on censorship now, so they don't even really need to communicate to, effectively censor conservatives. So ultimately, look, I think it's a good bill. If there's, support within the conference for it, we should definitely do everything we can to pass it. But we do need more. It can't just be focusing on direct federal government involvement, because that won't stop the censorship.
Well, what we need is the Supreme Court to take a 2x4 to the back of the executive branch's head and say, no more. You're not going to do this anymore. And I know that you've got Missouri v. Biden kind of working its way through the system. But what are the chances that it prevails in a massive free speech victory?
Let's hope they're good. I think it was a little bit discouraging that they, basically got rid of the previous ruling and stayed it, the injunction, basically saying for now, CISA and all these other agencies can continue to do what they were doing. But look, we do need this. Simply put, when you have government directing, or even some of these private companies that, effectively function as utilities, when they're censoring political speech and interfering with our elections, we don't really have a democracy. And I think that's what people are trying to avoid, and hopefully we can get some good news on that soon.
Do you think that the social media companies have learned any lessons from 2020, or have they doubled down?
It's really interesting. You're seeing some of them. Elon buying X, Twitter, has changed the game a little bit. I think you're seeing Facebook certainly change their tune, trying to, kind of get back in the good graces of Republicans. Ultimately, we're not going to know until 2024 when we have another high-stakes presidential election. Are these guys going to do exactly what they did in 2020? And my guess is they will. Yeah. I think ultimately the ideological pressure from the left will be too much.
I honestly think, I know as big as Facebook is, and sometimes it's hard to perceive that it's going to go away, I do think that it's in a declining sort of tailspin. And over time, Facebook will very likely go the way of MySpace. Perhaps Instagram won't for some time, but Facebook, it seems like it will. Maybe I'm wrong. But as we talk about this, we often talk about Facebook and Twitter as the priorities here. But the reality, Jon, is that there are much bigger behemoths involved in the way that information flows, in particular Google. And Google kind of avoids a lot of the scrutiny that these other guys get.
Yeah, definitely. It's because when you get censored on Facebook or Twitter, you notice, right? And so Google, what they do is surreptitiously basically prevent you from seeing information you didn't know you were supposed to see. And I think that's the real problem here. And ultimately, if you look at which social media companies influence the election the most, again, we talk about Facebook and Twitter with the censorship of the Hunter Biden story, but I would posit Google by far, just the way they covered issues like abortion and all different things, they're really able to manipulate the minds of voters. May have swung, there's actually a study out there from a Dr. Epstein, different Epstein, that showed, millions of voters switched their votes because of Google in 2020. So it's a powerful force.
Well, remember, there was that kind of infamous audio of a Google meeting where a bunch of employees were all crying, very sad that Donald Trump had won the election. And Google had this effort to get more Hispanic voters to turn up to vote. And they were very proud of this effort. But what they thought clearly was that it would result in votes for Democrats. They didn't anticipate that many Hispanic Americans would actually vote for Trump. And it's amazing. It's kind of an amazing, it should almost be a movie. It's an amazing exposition of Google attempting to wield its influence to result in good outcomes for Democrats, and it blew up in their face. But they know the power they have.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of, one of the so-called white pills, right, is that, our enemies are evil, but they also are kind of stupid sometimes. And I think that's what we see sometimes from these social media companies. But the reality is, if they really put their minds to it, again, Google can really change attitudes about how people perceive issues, and they can really, convey opinions. And look, I think that they had a significant impact in 2020 on the way people perceive Donald Trump. And even after that, let's not forget the craziness after January 6th when, we were censoring every which way. Google and Facebook and Twitter, they all had an impact on how the American people saw those events in real time.
So what are the solutions, if any, that Washington should embrace in order to get us on the right track here? Because I do think that the tyrannical abuse of power by large institutions that have a monopoly on, say, American thought, which certainly Google does, whether you like it or not. You can use Bing all you want, but there's so many people who are influenced by Google's decision-making that it does pose a problem for you and your family. How do we confront that, Jon?
We certainly should get back to enforcing antitrust law and trying to ensure competition in the marketplace to prevent companies like Google from getting so big to begin with and so influential to begin with. But also, I think it's really important to look at speech. I still, it's not as fun to talk about anymore, but I still look at Section 230 reform as the potential savior here, and basically saying, hey, if you're a social media company, you basically need to function like a utility and not discriminate on the basis of user speech. Obviously, if it's illegal speech, sure, go for it. Get rid of obscenity, get rid of calls to violence. But, if they're making an argument that there's only two genders or what have you, you can't censor that speech. And I think that's probably what the Republican solution on this needs to be. The problem is, Democrats oppose that. They want censorship. They really have embraced that full-heartedly. And that's not going to change anytime soon.
Right. But when you remove a certain category of speech because you disagree with it politically, you're making an editorial judgment. You're not merely a platform or a vehicle for communication. It'd be like if you and I were talking on the phone, as we are now, actually, and I wasn't able to hear portions of the conversation because the phone company decided that they were off limits.
Yeah, it's dystopian, frankly. I mean, the American ideal has always been free speech and letting bad speech be exposed for what it is. And the left, upheld that belief up until recently. And I think what happened is they realized they controlled all of the levers of power, all of the institutions, and they, to their advantage, decided to use that to try to shut down their opponents. And that's what we're going through right now. But, ultimately, if you do care about speech, if you care about ideas being debated and having the best ideas rise to the top, you should be against censorship, even censorship of ideas that we don't like, ideas that are morally repugnant, because ultimately we want to expose those.
Yes, for sure. Well, a good example of that these past few weeks has been all of these crazy people who support Hamas on college campuses. I know there's some chatter about how do we stop them from talking? No, baby. I had Bobby Barack on the show earlier. He just wrote a whole column on this subject. Let them talk. They're exposing themselves with every word they utter. Free speech is a good thing, especially because it exposes who the craziest people are. Jon Schweppe, thank you very much over at the American Principles Project. Really appreciate your time today, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, Vince.
That's Jon Schweppe. He is an excellent guy. All right. I'm going to move on here. We're going to play some audio for you coming up on Kamala Harris. I do have the Kamala Harris 60 Minutes clip. I told you on Friday that I was, normally I'm not in the mood to plug 60 Minutes. Hey, you should watch 60 Minutes this weekend. But as soon as I saw it was going to be Kamala Harris, I got so excited. I was like, man, I did it. And it lived up to kind of what I expected. Bill Whitaker, who did the interview, gave her the gentlest of treatments. He gave her Nerf softballs. It was such an easy interview to do, and she was still practically drowning. She was barely keeping her head above water, flailing around, trying to survive the interview. So that's fantastic. Also, we've got some audio for you today from Mike Johnson, who is now Speaker of the House. Have you become accustomed? Do you remember his name when you have to summon it? You're like, oh yeah, the new Speaker of the House, and you sit there for a second. And you're like, what is that name? What is that name? Mike Johnson. They were parodying this on Saturday Night Live this weekend. Kind of amusing. And here I've got some. I'll tell you what. I'll share the Mike Johnson audio coming up in a moment. This is on whether or not they're going to send a subpoena to the Biden crime family. Mike Johnson speaking with Maria Bartiromo over on Fox. Hold tight. It's 5:19 now. Yeah, more coming up on Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. Kamala pretending that she's in the room all the time, always involved in all the major decisions. Joe consults with her 50 times a day. It's all hilarious, honestly. Well, it's really sad, but I like laughing at it. Mike Johnson is the current Speaker of the House. He was on with Maria Bartiromo this weekend on a little show called Sunday Morning Futures. They talked about the Biden crime family and what Congress is going to do about them.
Are you expecting to subpoena Hunter Biden?
I'm looking at that. I think that desperate times call for desperate measures, and that perhaps is overdue. We've not made a full decision yet. I'm counseling with the attorneys involved on all of this to see what the contours of. I'm an attorney myself, so I speak the language. We're trying to move forward on some of this very aggressively. I think the American people are owed these answers, and I think our suspicions about all this, the evidence that we've gathered so far, as you know, is affirming what many of us feared may be the worst. And, as Jamie Comer likes to say, bank records don't lie. We already have a lot of this evidence. The dots are being connected, and we'll see where it leads.
Yeah, we do have a mountain of evidence, don't we? A mountain of it. How much more do you need before you can answer that question in the affirmative? I guess one of the things Mike Johnson is probably dealing with now is that he has to get everyone together in his conference to support this. Well, then put them in a room and then let them ask questions until everybody is satisfied that it's time to move from so-called impeachment inquiry into full-blown impeachment. Yeah, I got it. The Senate is not going to be for it. But look, if you are going to launch an impeachment at any time, you should do it now. Do it now. You want to do it right up against the election? You're going to launch the impeachment right then? Will that redound to your benefit? I don't know about that. I don't know about that. But now's the time, and the evidence is overwhelming. How many more business partners do you need to pop out of the woodwork and say that Joe Biden was involved in a corrupt business deal, or that he attended dinners to smooth things over, or that he was getting 10% for the big guy, or that there was a bribery scheme involved in Ukraine? How many more people? How many more witnesses? How many more FBI informants? The FBI had over 40 confidential human sources contributing information on the Biden crime family. Over 40! We just found out from Congress this past week. How many more do you need? Isn't it amazing? And so I get it. Look, Speaker Johnson has a tough job. He's got to, what do they call it? Herd cats in the United States House of Representatives. But just speak forcefully. Get out there and fight. We'll see. You know, he answered a number of questions this weekend with Maria Bartiromo. Among them, it sounds like we're headed for another continuing resolution for a short window at least while they try and get a budget passed. That's what it does sound like is going to happen. And, well, they burned 3 weeks trying to pick a new Speaker of the House. So we've got Mike Johnson. Yep. New Speaker of the House. So back to business. And that whole impeachment inquiry was really put on ice, wasn't it, during the speaker chase? So now we've got one. Let's see if they can get back to business on the impeachment thing, too. Kamala Harris and her hilarious answers to 60 Minutes coming up on the Vince Coglianese Show. Well, hey there. It's 5:35 now. News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Joe Biden is an old man. He's so old that Joe Scarborough is now saying he thinks he's old.
Mika and I, everybody we talk to, every political discussion, it talks a lot about Trump, but when it comes to Joe Biden, people say, man, he's too old to run, isn't he? I mean, he's not really going to run. When I say every discussion, I don't mean 99% of the discussions. Every discussion.
Every single one. In fact, here's the old man earlier this week.
And also our continued enhancement of stability in the Indo-Pacific in that whole area.
Sounds as cogent as ever. I have been running around. Corey and I have been looking through all of our clips. There's so many to choose from of Joe Biden being old, being very, very old. Here's another one of him just whispering like a creep.
People are waiting for relief. I got them $1.9 trillion relief so far. They're going to be getting checks in the mail that are consequential this week.
What a weirdo. Anyway, so that's Joe Biden. So that might leave you wondering, well, what are our alternatives? Obviously, we'd prefer a Republican president in there, but who else might take the job up until the next election? And the answer to that, unfortunately, might be the vice president of the United States. One heartbeat away from the president, Kamala Harris. She was on 60 Minutes this weekend. She was being interviewed by Bill Whitaker. Is interviewed the right word? I don't think that's the right word. There's a better word for this somewhere. She was, Chris Plant would say she was being fluffed, I think, by Bill Whitaker this weekend. Let's listen to some of this. One of the things I was looking forward to is Kamala Harris having to explain what's going on in Israel right now because she's famous for her explanations on foreign policy. Here she is talking about Israel.
Israel, without any question, has a right to defend itself. That being said, it is very important that there be no conflation between Hamas and the Palestinians.
You think she practiced the word conflation before this interview?
The Palestinians deserve equal measures of safety and security, self-determination and dignity. And we have been very clear that
the uptalk is killer. You hearing this? Safety and security and dignity. The Palestinians.
Between Hamas and the Palestinians. The Palestinians deserve equal measures of safety and security, self-determination and dignity. And we have been very clear that the rules of war must be adhered to, and that there be humanitarian aid that flows.
Oh, a little variation on the end there. So that's Kamala Harris, the sum total of what she knows about what's happening right now. 60 Minutes didn't even have to edit that portion down. That's the literal extent of her knowledge on this subject. Bill Whitaker also asked, what is going on with young people? It used to be, long ago, that young people were on board with the Biden-Harris agenda. They no longer are. Can you uptalk an explanation for us?
A recent CBS poll found that at the beginning of President Biden's term, 70% of young people, people under 30, said he was doing a good job. Mm-hmm. Now it's less than 50%. Why is that? What's going on?
Our administration. Next question.
If you poll how young people feel about the climate and the warming of our planet, it polls as one of their top concerns. When we talk about what we are doing with student loan debt, polls very high. The challenge that we have...
We're just literally stealing people's money to pay off Harvard law graduates. Yeah, that's a really good plan. It polls very high among the recipients of our theft.
Polls as one of their top concerns. When we talk about what we are doing with student loan debt, polls very high. The challenge that we have as an administration is we got to let people know who brung it to them. That's our challenge. Ooh. But it is not that the work we are doing is not very, very popular with a lot of people.
Oh, I love this answer. So Kamala Harris, did you hear that? She said that young people are just too ignorant to realize how great the Biden administration has been. They're just too uninformed. We haven't had a chance to tell them. We got to get to them. We got to get on TikTok. We got to let them know that we have just been fantastic for their lives. Now, their lives are not improved in any material way, but we need to at least convince them that we've just been a blast. So Kamala Harris says the young are too ignorant to realize how great she is. That's why the polls look like they do.
Do you have to ask yourself, why are people seeming not to hear our message?
I look at it more as, let's keep getting out there. And as with any election, we got to make our case to the American people. That's part of our responsibility. And that's this process. And that's what it is. And that's a fair process.
What is she even talking about? Did any of that make sense to you? This is so funny. Anyway, that woman's literally the vice president of the United States. Did you win a contest? How did that happen? Bill Whitaker wants to know why. I don't know. How do you even ask this question? He knows the answer to this question.
Why are you not 30 points ahead?
Well, I'm not a political pundit, so I'm not going to speak to that. But what I will say is this. When the American people are able to take a close look at election time on their options, I think the choice is going to be clear. Bill, we're going to win. Let me just tell you that. We're going to win.
Wow, that's confident. That sounded familiar, I should say. 30 points. Why aren't you 30 points ahead? There's a certain former aspiring president of the United States who wants to ask this.
Why aren't I 50 points ahead, you might ask? Well, the choice for working families has never been clearer.
Yeah.
I need your help to get Donald Trump's record out to everybody. Nobody should be fooled.
Who told her that screaming into a microphone was a good idea? How's that going to help you? Hillary Clinton, everybody. There's a single person applauding. Hillary Clinton, why aren't I 50 points ahead? She screamed into a microphone. Well, that's one reason. This whole presentation. The working families. Actually, working families did so much better under Trump than any of these clowns. Not even close. Not even close. So the media asking the old Hillary question, why aren't you 50 points ahead? I guess in Biden and Kamala's case, the media know that there's no chance it would be 50 points. So why aren't you 30 points ahead, they ask. Let's see here. Bill Whitaker asks, going back to the Israel stuff for a moment, as, of course, Israel being subjected to this big terror attack. Bill Whitaker wants to know, what is the message to Iran, which is stirring up so much trouble all over the planet, the leading state sponsor of terror? Kamala Harris, give us your detailed assessment of how we're going to contain Iran.
What's the message to Iran?
Don't.
As President Biden said, just don't.
Exactly. One word. Pretty straightforward.
This is, have you put any thought into this subject? Has anyone in the White House put any thought into this subject? What does don't mean? Half the people who work in the White House are part of an Iranian influence operation. What are you talking about when you say don't? Don't start dinner without us. We'll be there soon. Don't order yet. Biden did the same thing with Scott Pelley.
And I wonder, what is your message to Hezbollah and its backer, Iran?
Don't. Don't.
Yeah, he sounds vivacious there, doesn't he? He's thriving. Bill Whitaker wants to know, how come Kamala Harris is failing on all of her tasks? He doesn't ask it like that. He's a little more gentle.
Most Americans say that they don't think you're doing a good job on the border.
It's unbelievable how they have to preload these questions. He's like, look, it's not me who's saying this. It's polls. Most Americans don't think you're doing a great job.
You and the administration. The number of people trying to cross the U.S. southern border is at an all-time high.
Trying to cross. I think he may be understating what's actually happening. They are crossing. They're not just trying to cross. They are succeeding, pouring into our country, foreign nationals, by the millions, aided and abetted by the woman sitting in front of you and the goofy old president she works with and the cartels. They're pouring across the country in record numbers. It's not merely trying.
It's no secret that we have a broken immigration system. Short term, we need a safe, orderly, and humane border policy. And long term, we need to invest in the root causes of migration.
If only we gave more money to foreign countries, this would all go away. I think the Biden administration specializes in that particular form of problem solving, giving other countries your money.
But the bottom line, Congress needs to act. Come on, participate in the solution instead of political gamesmanship.
Do you know what the White House is asking Congress to do right now with the border? Do you know what they're asking? Biden just gave a big address on this. They want, as a part of that $100 billion package, the package that's supposedly designed to help Israel. Israel, I think, is the smallest portion of that bill. It's the smallest one. The biggest is to give the corrupt government of Ukraine a lot more money. And then the next item is to send $14 billion to the border, not to secure it, but instead to process people into the country more quickly, to make it so that illegal immigrants will stay here. Congress needs to help, says Kamala Harris. Congress needs to act. What is the White House suggesting Congress do? Help people get into the country. It's only going to accelerate the border crisis. You think she knows? Who knows? Kamala Harris, I think this is the finest answer she gave during the whole interview. I belly laughed when I listened to this.
We were talking to some Democratic donors, and they have told us that should something befall President Biden and he is not able to run, that there would be a free-for-all for who would run as president. You are in the spot that would be a natural for you to step up, but we're hearing from donors that they would not naturally fall into line.
Okay. Do you hear the throat clearing he's doing with this question? It's a very simple question. If Biden can't run for president next year, Democrats don't want to just give it to you, Kamala Harris. They want an open primary because they don't think you're up to the task. What do you say to them? That's the question. Instead, we get this winding setup. Well, we talk to donors and there's some open primary consideration.
Able to run, that there would be a free-for-all for who would run as president. You are in the spot that would be a natural for you to step up, but we're hearing...
I love how it pains him to ask the question, too.
...from donors that they would not naturally fall into line. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to engage in that hypothetical because Joe Biden is very much alive.
Oh, that's reassuring, isn't it? When you have to say that the president of the United States is alive.
And running for re-election. So
but you do know. I mean, that is a concern and a legitimate concern, I would.
And also, what's great here is that Bill is talking in euphemisms. What he's saying, in really practical, if I could just cut right to the chase, what if he dies? What if, he's not saying those words, but he's kind of dancing around it. And she's like, well, he's very much alive right now. I think pretty sure he's still alive. Do you think she keeps like a heartbeat monitor for Joe Biden on her phone or something? Does she keep track of that? How closely is she watching this subject? Bill Whitaker. He's like, but it is a concern, isn't it? He might die.
Because Joe Biden is very much alive and running for re-election. So
but you do know, I mean, that is a concern, and a legitimate concern, I would say.
I hear from a lot of different people, a lot of different things. But let me just tell you, I'm focused on the job.
That little nonsensical statement she just made, I hear from a lot of people, a lot of different things. Based on what Joe Scarborough just said, that this is entirely the conversation in her world, right? Let's be honest. What is Kamala Harris talking about with her closest friend? I didn't say friends. I don't know if she has multiple. But whoever that person is, what are they talking about on a constant basis? Is it now? Is it now? It might be now. Is it now? Call me in. Put me in, coach.
I truly am. Our democracy is on the line, Bill. And I frankly, in my head, do not have time for parlor games. When we have a...
I like how she was about to say in my brain, and then she bailed to in my head, because I guess brain wouldn't work. In my head.
And I frankly, in my head, do not have time for parlor games. When we have a president who is running for re-election. That's it.
The old 60 minutes pregnant pause. You hear that? Bill Whitaker, he didn't want to say anything because he said, go ahead, say more. Say more. Say more. She didn't take the bait. Although a lot of people do take the bait on that. She just said, that's it. But that is actually a good interview technique. You sit there and you don't say anything. And if you don't say anything, this is human. This is just a kind of a human interaction thing. If no one is saying anything, both parties are desperate to fill the vacuum, right? Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and then it's silence, and then the silence goes on just a little too long? You're like, I got to say something. I got to bail out of this silence. And it's a good technique. So props to Bill Whitaker. That's the best part of the interview for him, where he didn't say a word. Kamala Harris. She always delivers exactly what I expected. It's 5:51 now. Let's take Steve in Ashburn now. Steve is on line one. Good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hello, Vince. Excellent show. Great points all around. Quick comment about Kamala. At least she didn't say period at the end of what she said, and she didn't say full stop. But she did sound like she had gone to band camp, and so maybe she needs a voice coach.
What is that? The uptalk. They say it's a psychological tick that especially some women have, but I think some men do it too. It's kind of strange. And it emanates out of insecurity. Like you don't actually have enough self-confidence to be able to convey your thoughts well. And the uptalk, I don't know if this is true, but sounds kind of true. The uptalk is associated with a lack of, self-worth. And maybe that's what's going on with Kamala Harris.
And she's fundamentally an unserious person. If you've listened to just about anything she says, do you really want her to have her finger on the button? And what if she gets the call at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Not a chance in hell. Thank you, Steve. It's a good question. That's really the fundamental question, isn't it? Not a chance. Hey, something I'm seeing develop right now is the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. The left, as they are starting to do their homework on him, are angry that he's a devout Christian, that he and his wife are Christians. And they've begun posting all sorts of vile stuff to the internet, suggesting that he's leading us into a theocracy and he's going to be the worst thing that's happened ever. We have tyrants in charge right now, and they're attacking the guy for being a good Christian. Please. We'll have more on that later this week. The great one, Mark Levin, up next here on WMAL.